In this video, I want to show you how to create some basic patterns using the pattern options panel. So before I get there, I just wanted to mention a couple of things about my file and getting things set up. So here I created a uh, an image trace version of the t-shirt template downloaded from Haiku. I've expanded it so it's essentially a vector object now with paths and anchor points. And I've also created this or made it into a live paint group. So if I go to object and down to live paint, you can see it's the only option here for live paint is to release that. So I don't want to release it, but I do want to keep it as a live paint group. So if you haven't created or downloaded the template yet, make sure you do that. Go through the steps with the image trace as previously shown. Make sure you expand it and convert it to a live paint group. And once I've done that, just to kind of get my file set up, I do want to make several copies of this layer. So I'm going to hover my cursor over that layer, the t-shirt template layer, hold the Alt button, and then click and drag some additional copies. And we are going to be doing quite a few patterns, so I would recommend getting 5 or 6 copies of this. Lock at least one layer of that, and we can just turn off some of those other additional copies. All right, so I have numerous t-shirt template copies that I can apply patterns later. So I'm going to just hide my layers panel a little bit for the moment. And I'm going to move over here to my other artboard to start creating some objects for my pattern. And as far as pattern making, designs, you could pretty much make whatever you want. I'm going to just start out with a basic rectangle, maybe with a gradient fill, and maybe we'll give it a nice dark red stroke, and we'll click and drag out a square. I'm holding shift. And maybe we'll bump up the stroke a little bit so we can see that a little bit more easily. All right, so once I've created my object, I'm ready to make a pattern. So essentially, you go to Object, down to Pattern, and over to Make, and click Make. And automatically, that does a couple of things. It brings up your pattern options panel and this little dialog box that says, hey, the new pattern has been added to the swatches panel. So you really don't need to have this pop up every time. So I would recommend clicking the Don't Show Again button and then click OK, because as you create more patterns, you don't want that popping up every single time. All right, so as you can see here, what this has done, the pattern options, it's giving me my object in the center, and it's repeating that object as a pattern with 5 by 5 copies. To make things run a little faster, I'm going to switch this to a 3 by 3, just so it takes a little less time to render all these objects. If you have a really complex design and you're going with 7 by 5, it's just going to slow your machine down quite a bit and won't really run very efficiently. So I would recommend going with a 3 by 3 pattern. So again, 3 by 3 is probably where I would go for this, just so you can get a sense of the pattern without overburdening your processor on your computer. Team copies, if you click this off, you'll see the pattern as it would appear at 100% opacity, but I would like to dim this a little bit more, just so I can kind of get a sense of, what's going on with my design as opposed to the pattern that it's creating. For a square like this, it's not really a big deal, but the more complex the pattern you get, this will become more of an issue, and it's a little easier to kind of keep track of things if you have the copies dimmed. Over here on some other parts of the pattern options panel, well, I probably ought to give this a new name. We'll just call it a gradient square. Real basic. Hit enter. So I've given it a name. For tile type, this is the outline, this blue bounding box is the outline of my tile type. So you have some options here. You can go with grid, brick by row, brick by column, hex by column, and hex by row. Now, depending on what look you like, the effect you're after, you can also change a few things down here on the overlap. Sometimes, depending on which tile type you have set, this will give you varying results. But it looks like if I have the bottom and front, you can see it's bringing the bottom of the front of my design to the foreground. So if I go with grid, that's not really going to change anything, at least not for the settings I have at this point. If I'm on brick by row, I can offset the brick, or adjust the brick offset. You have some different settings here. So play around with that, see which look you like. But the brick offset only works on either brick by row or brick by column. It's not going to work when you get into just the straight grid. All right, so as far as editing this, well, I can still edit my object. If I just switch the move tool, I click on that square, I can change this up. I can, put no stroke. I can change the fill. If I have a solid fill and as opposed to a gradient, you can kind of see the different results there. Okay, I think I'm just going to go with maybe I like that gradient. We'll switch back to that, the gradient with maybe that red stroke on there. So you can kind of get a sense of what that's going to look like. Now, if I want to space these out a bit, I can do that a couple different ways. I would click the pattern tile tool up here. So you want to click that, and then you can adjust this bounding box to space out the objects in your pattern. So maybe I wanted to stretch this out a little bit. And if you notice, these numbers over here are changing. So if I knew for a fact I wanted to make this 2 inches by 2 inches, you can manually change that as well. And so this is a little bit more, gives you a little bit more precision as far as adjusting that. But again, if I want to bring those closer together, I can just adjust my bounding box for the pattern tile tool. And if I want them touching, just bring this all the way in and adjust it like so. So if I wanted to create some additional shapes, I can still do that. I can come over to my shape tool. Maybe we'll put a star in the center, and maybe the star can have maybe, I don't know, maybe a blue fill. And if you notice, I switched the fill on this, and it changed everything. So I'm going to press Control Z to back up. If you don't want that to happen, you have to click off of that shape. So I still had that original square highlighted or active. So I want to click off of that with my move tool, then switch back to the star tool. And for the star, let's try this again. We'll give it a blue fill. And we'll keep that same red stroke. And if you hover closely, let's zoom in a little bit. And you can click and drag the panel option or the pattern options panel away. But if you get close to this, it'll give you, if you have your smart guides on, it'll show you where the center of this is. So I'm going to hold Shift and Alt and pull out a star. And you can see, as soon as I do that, it instantly gives me that repeated design. And you can get as complicated with this as you want. If you want to do something with the pen tool, and remember to click off of that. You could draw with the pen tool as well. And maybe on this I had no stroke, or no fill, excuse me. And so if I needed to adjust some anchor points, I can use the direct selection tool and bring that over and adjust this however I wanted. And you can play around with it and get it as perfect as you want. All right, so that's a real basic way to create a very simple pattern, nothing too complicated. Now, at any time, if I am happy with this, all I have to do is a couple of things. I could save a copy, or I could just click Done. Let me zoom out. So as you can see over here, the pattern I created is in my swatches panel. So coming over to my t-shirt design, I go back to my live paint bucket, and I activate this pattern as my fill. I might want to turn the stroke off. I can just hover inside here. Oops, try that again. Go to the swatches panel, click on my pattern, and then fill that in. And you can hopefully get an idea what this is going to look like. So very quickly, it's quite easy to create that pattern. And there you have it. So real quick, easy way to create a pattern in Illustrator. If I wanted to edit this at any time, I come back over to my pattern swatch, double click, and I can bring that back up, and it brings me right back to my options panel for the pattern options. So again, I could just switch to the selection tool, click on any of these objects, switch up the color, click done, and those changes are automatically reflected in my artwork. So that's, again, pretty much a real basic way to create patterns in Illustrator.